All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you to this special Lunch with the Friends program. I'm Chris Knopp, the Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. And today our topic is the Root Beer Lady. And we are so very lucky to have Kim Schultz, who is the actor and writer of the play, The Root Beer Lady, that's playing at the History Theater, and Addie Gorlin-Han, who is the director of the play. A little bit about Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. There are three pillars of our work: people, wilderness, and community. We connect people to the wilderness through our No Boundaries to the Boundary Waters education program. We protect the wilderness. We've been advocates since our founding in 1976 for the Boundary Waters. And then finally, we support the communities, Ely, Grand Marais, the Gunflint Trail, and the North Shore that are gateways to the Boundary Waters. And so, as many of you know, that we have great news to start off with about the Boundary Waters, and that the headline for the Star Tribune last week had this wonderful headline that the Biden administration, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, announced a moratorium, a 20-year moratorium on mineral leases on 225,000 acres adjacent to the Boundary Waters that supplies the clean water that Dorothy Molter used for 50 years to make root beer. And so we are very happy and are still celebrating, still on a high as an organization from the Biden administration's decision. As we get started here, just a couple housekeeping items. You know, there's a Q&A button on the bottom, and then there's also a chat function as well. We add chats or Q&As at the bottom. So please do that. I know many of you may have met Dorothy Molter. Maybe you want to share your story with us in the chat, and let us know where you're from. So if you want to place that in the chat function where you're from here, and we'll begin this. We'll do a few things this afternoon. We'll go over the incredibly compelling story of Dorothy Molter, and we'll get to know Kim and Addie as people and what drew them to this story, and how the story resonates with them. And then we want to create some community here with all of you that have had experiences perhaps with Dorothy Molter or found her story inspiring. And then finally, we'll kind of reflect on what lessons that Dorothy Molter has for us today. And so my colleague, Maggie Morin, is also on the Zoom, and she'll be helping monitor the questions and chats there. So starting off here, Kim, well, first, congratulations. I had the good fortune to be part of watch opening night on Saturday at the History Theater. It was a great performance, very compelling. And Kim, tell us about yourself and what drew you to the Dorothy Molter story, and tell us a little bit about yourself there.
Sure. Thank you so much, Chris, for having myself and Addie here. We're very happy to be here with this Boundary Waters group. I am Kim Schultz. I'm the actor and playwright of the solo show, The Root Beer Lady, currently at the History Theater in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I'm an actor and a writer, an improviser, and was thrilled to happen upon the story of Dorothy Molter when I was up at Tofty Lake Center a few years back, and heard about this woman who lived an independent life for 56 years in the middle of nowhere and sold root beer. And that hooked my attention. And I started to do some more research into her, and started to fall in love with her story, and was very intrigued. And so I was at Tofty for about a week, and by the end of that week, I'd already had almost half of a solo show completed and an idea of the direction it was heading. So I was inspired, to say the least. And I also took lots of canoe rides when I was up there, and was imagining Dorothy as I was doing all of my canoe rides and hikes around the area up there near Ely. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. And Addie, tell us about your connection to the Boundary Waters and your work as director of this play. And I'm going to crack open my celebratory Dorothy Molter's root beer. Great.
Perfect timing. Yeah, thanks again for having us here. So I have a couple connections to the Boundary Waters. The first is that I grew up going to Camp Mishawaka all throughout my summers as a kid. And my new claim to fame that I've never been able to put on my resume, but I've gotten to talk a lot about in the context of this show, is that I was one of the first women to pass the boys camp expert canoeing class, which was all about solo paddling in the Boundary Waters, and we got to take a trip associated with it. So that was a big part of my childhood. That was my summers. And then in the winter, I was always the kid who was bitter at my parents because instead of going down south for spring break to Florida, like I felt all the other kids got to, we would go dog sledding or cross country skiing up in the Boundary Waters. So year round, the Boundary Waters is an important place in my life, and a way that I really came to appreciate and love being a kid growing up here in Minnesota. So when Kim reached out, I was pretty excited to be able to use this other half of me, that was not the city kid making theater, but the kid who really appreciated the wilderness, and whose family really hammered that in willingly and unwillingly growing up here in the Twin Cities. And then I'm a director. I'm the associate producer at the Guthrie in Minneapolis, and a freelance director on the side.
Thank you, Addie, for that. I'd like to explore the sort of collaboration between the two of you. And Addie, perhaps you could explain how do you direct a one-person play? So what does that entail?
Yeah, it's a good question because Kim was both a playwright and the performer. So it was a true collaboration between sort of the three of us, her as playwright, her as performer, and then me as director. And I would say I think that what I really saw my job for Kim was to be the first audience member, so that anything that I felt like didn't quite make sense, or any parts of the story that I felt like we skipped, I would give her that feedback and help her to sort of clarify those moments of storytelling. And I think the other two things that I really saw my responsibility as a director is to create the world around Kim. So hiring and gathering and guiding conversations around the scenic design and the lights and the projection and the sound, and figuring out how to make sure that the world around Kim helps support her tell the story. And then also just being sort of the person outside helping make sure that the pacing was happening. So like making sure that, it stayed engaging the whole time. And Kim has such an impossible job being a one person performer, because it's all her, and she'll speak more to that. But it's also my job to help her to understand, where we're sort of coming out of the story and where we need to be sort of driving forward. So I'll stop there. I'm sure Kim will have much more to say about what that collaboration looks like.
Kim, please expand on that, what that collaboration looks like from your dual role as both the actor and the playwright.
Well, I'm so grateful for Addie, because she was a true collaborator on this, and did provide the eyes and the ears on the outside. And it's a weird thing when the playwright is the actor. And so it's like this, it's a maneuvering that we do. Actually, I think we slipped into quite easily from the get-go, but it's about, for me, I knew the show so well, and it was so a part of me that I had made a lot of decisions, or I knew a lot about it. So then the challenge for me, and the curiosity for me, and the amazing thing for me, was to see it from new eyes, from Addie's perspective, and to go, okay, oh, that doesn't make sense, or okay, that needs to, move forward. So it's a little bit of a different creature than if I was just the actor and she was the director, but because I was the creator of it and it was my show, and I've been working on it for a couple years, it was about trying to find how we can do what we both want to do, which I think we succeeded at. So I think it's such a unique operation. And I was just grateful for the History Theater for allowing us that space, and for Addie for being open to a way of collaborating with me. And it's kind of a magic process, this solo show, because it's such a unique beast of a theatrical form.
Kim, you mentioned it took you 2 years to write this, so you had sort of an initial burst, right? And then you went into a research mode, or how explain
Yeah.
the process for writing?
It didn't actually take me 2 years to write it. I actually wrote it quite quickly.
Okay.
But I wrote it in 2019. And as I said before I left Tofty, I don't know who the we is. I had about 10 pages already, and I finished it within a couple months. And then I was also doing research at the time. I had, as many of your audience I'm sure will know, there are several books about Dorothy Molter. There are some oral archives that were recorded up in Ely in 2015. There is, of course, the Dorothy Molter Museum, which is up in Ely, which I visited and researched and was in touch with the folks from there. They supported with some supplemental materials. I took a look at some of her journals. So I'd done a lot of research. And then in 2020, some of us may remember what happened early that year. And COVID came and pretty much shut things down. And I kind of went into a writing hibernation. I just couldn't imagine doing any writing at that time. And it was interesting because some artists really were prolific and were able to like use that time to do their work. And some artists were like me who just shut down, and I just couldn't pick up the Dorothy bandwagon until the end of the year when Ron Peluso at the History Theater reached out and said, hey, do you want to do, we've been talking. And he said, hey, do you want to do a virtual reading of this Root Beer Lady play you've got for our audiences? And I went, yes, I better pick up my script again and start working on it. So towards the end of that year, I did pick up the script and start doing some edits and started working with a dramaturg, and we ended up doing a virtual performance of the play in March, I think, of 2021. So then the play was in pretty good shape. And then from there on out, it was just edits and rewrites. And it's a funny process because I kept thinking, well, the play is done. And then it was just, it's never done. And then even coming into this rehearsal process, Addie, we had, what we thought was the completed version of the Root Beer Lady. And then you put it on stage, you're like, not completed yet. And this line doesn't work. And this is not clear. And this needs to be cut and moved. And so the show was continuing to really shape through much to the horror of our poor stage manager who has to keep track of all the line edits, but the show is continuing to shape and move and grow much in a rehearsal process, which is the job of a rehearsal process. So that was kind of the journey of the script. And then, yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Well, that is quite the journey there, and maybe getting into the Dorothy Molter story. So you trace her upbringing from kind of a hard upbringing, then through Chicago, and then into Knife Lake there. And so why don't you talk about that first, the sort of baseline of Dorothy Molter, maybe before she gets to the Boundary Waters, maybe and the serendipitous and happenstance that led her to the Boundary Waters.
Yeah, I think it was kind of serendipitous happenstance that led us both to the Boundary Waters. Dorothy was a young nursing student in Chicago, where I actually currently live. And her father invited her to be a fill-in on some fishing trip, in her words, because somebody got sick. And so she ended up going on this trip to the Northwoods that she had no idea about. She was a city girl. She was in nursing school. It was 1930. So everyone was expecting her to, finish her nursing degree, get married, settle down, become a nurse in Chicago. And she just goes on this random trip up to the Northwoods and had I think a profound, life-changing, clearly experience that she decided that this was her home and that she never wanted to leave. So she ended up coming back for 3 years as a summer job. So she was also strong and smart and a hard worker. And Bill Berglund, who was the gentleman who owned the resort on Isle of Pines at that time, recognized that and offered her a summer job. And her father eventually agreed, and she went up there for 3 summers and learned the ropes and decided that this was in fact home and that she for real wasn't wanting to leave. And so she had an opportunity to go up there and stay after she finished her nursing degree, and she did. And she started moving there. She moved there and lived there full time starting in 1934, I believe. And I don't think ever looked back. I think this was always what she wanted, and she fought to keep it for a long time. Eventually, Bill Berglund died, and through a whole series of events, not easily, it appears she was eventually bequeathed, deeded, if you will, the 3 islands, Isle of Pines at Knife Lake, and ended up staying there for the remainder of her life.
You know, Addie, as you're hearing Kim tell this part of the story, what were things that you were trying to make sure came out in this early part of the Dorothy Molter story?
A great question. I think it's really important that we understand how connected she is to the land, and how there's a very clear moment when she steps out of that canoe and realizes that this is home. We worked a lot on those moments of realization, and also we worked a lot on the different character changes, because Kim is an incredibly talented artist and she plays lots of different characters. So she plays Bill Berglund, the man she was just talking about, and she plays all these other characters. So it was important for us to also establish sort of the rules of the world that she would be playing, telling the story as Dorothy in her older age, but also playing all of the different characters along the way, and setting up those rules of the world were important.
And I think it was, for me in the writing of the play, it was in this journey of her from being 23 when she first got there, and this wide-eyed city girl who had never been up to the Northwood / Boundary Waters area. And then the 79-year-old who we visit in the play as well, and really the span of ages between then as well, as she maneuvers her life. But I think in those early years, it's about what Addie was saying. It's about the wonder, it's about the awe, it's about the discovery, it's about her journey, it's about her finding her feet in a way where I think she immediately found her heart. And then it took her a couple years to get her feet under her and figure out how it works when you are in the wilderness, and how you have to shoot deer to survive, and how you have to learn how to be in the nature, not fight the nature, be a part of it and be connected to it. And I think that she learned that in a way that surprised a lot of people in her life.
Yeah, it is a very remote place. I have on our map behind me the location where you see that posted. That's Dorothy Molter's cabin, Isle of the Pines there, and so you can see all this water and all this wilderness all around there. So she was, very much out there by herself. Kim, you in the play, you
ride 12-hour by snowshoe in the winter, she says. So it's a long day's canoe ride to get to the nearest road, not even to Ely. That was to a road, and then from the road you had to figure out how to get into town, which I think is another 12 miles. Maybe people in this audience can correct me, but it's another hike into town. So that's just to the nearest road. So yes, she was quite isolated. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Chris.
No, you were as part of that early part of the play, you really touch on the dynamic of Dorothy with her father Cap, and that kind of dynamic where he had certain expectations, and Dorothy had a different path that she was cutting for herself. And so there was that dynamic in the relationship that I think went full circle over time. And but there, talk about how her father reacted to this and how that relationship evolved over time.
Yeah, so we don't have all the information, but the information that we do have, and that has been extrapolated and learned and found in her journals that have been shared by her family, is and then I'll also say that I made some leaps as a playwright as well. So not having all the details, I made some decisions as to what I felt was A, most dramatically interesting, and B, felt accurate, based on the information we did have, but we don't have all the details. So what I think we do know / I suspect is that her father thought it was kind of an okay thing in the middle of the Depression that his daughter went up. He loved it. He was an outdoorsman. Like, it was his place, Knife Lake. And he loved to fish. So he was, I think, happy that his daughter was learning some of these outdoor skills, and it was probably an interesting thing for a couple years. I'm sure he was worried about her. She was a young female going up there, but as I say in the play, it was the beginning of the Great Depression, and there was no nursing work to be had in Chicago. So she had a summer job. And then I think it probably shifted for him when she said, it's not just summer job. I want to live up there. And I think that that was probably a pivotal moment in their relationship where she was not willing to get married at that point and settle down and be a nurse in Chicago, but she wanted to do something radically different than what women were doing in 1934. And so I think that that was a sort of a breaking point. I say in the play, "You'll do it without my blessing," when she decides to move up to the Northwoods. And so I think that was, I think she had to make a choice. She could stay and make other people happy, and she could do the life that was expected of her and get married and be a nurse and just do that, or she could do what she knew in her heart, I think, was her life that was waiting for her. And she didn't want to pass up her opportunity for her life that was waiting for her. So she broke the norms of the time. She went against all the rules of society of what was expected of a woman in 1934, and moved unmarried up to a remote resort cabin. And somebody asked again, it was 15 miles by canoe and 12 miles by snowshoe in the winter to the nearest road. So she was to go to this place that felt like home. So I think that that journey and that choice affected her relationship with her father, which I have her struggling with the whole time, her whole life. And at some point, Cap, her dad, came back up, and we don't have a lot of information exactly what that tension and that dynamic was like, but I make it up that, it was probably a little awkward at first, but that they both were like, "I love you, glad you're here." She says that to him, "Glad you're here, Cap." Like, "I'm glad we're past that moment of the toughness." And he probably had to at that point go like, "This is my daughter's life. Look what she's done." And perhaps he was a little impressed as well.
And there are a few questions here, and I'll pose some of these to both of you here, both Kim and Addie. What surprised you about Dorothy as you got into her stories? Or something that surprised you about her?
You want to try Addie one? You want to take that one, and then I'll think about an answer.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think it's not, well, it surprises me, but I think it more inspired me the way that she articulates, and this is really through Kim, but articulates her values of being alone versus lonely. And that she is just so not alone because she had such an incredible network of friends and people who knew her and such an extensive community. But that she is alone for much of the year as well. And so striking that balance and the exploration of that, I think I thought I was about to direct a play about a woman who lived alone and was lonely. And I became surprised through learning more about her and through our work together that actually she was just so amongst so many beloved people who loved and cared for her. And I think what has truly surprised me is how many people have come to see the show who know her, and I'm seeing in the chat have had these experiences with her. So it's so cool, this ripple effect that she had among this like much greater expansive network of humans.
Yeah, I would second that. And I would say that, there was lots, of course, that surprised me internally in her story, little moments and like the amazing things she did, like haul Bill Berglund in the middle of a blizzard for 2 days to safety. Otherwise he would have died. Like crazy stories of her abilities. But I would say that also overall, I have been really surprised by every single person who I talk to has a story about Dorothy Molter and her reach, and how deep and wide that reach was, and how people loved her. I got an email from somebody the other day saying they were up there in early 80s and the bear took their food and she set them up for 3 days with cheese sandwiches and candy bars. It's those kind of things that I'm like, oh, cheese sandwiches and candy bars. Like she helped people survive. And as I have her saying in the play, it was, it turns out it's a good thing that there's a nurse in the wilderness, because she literally helped people survive as well when there was injuries and whatnot. So I think that the love that people feel for Dorothy Molter, and me, I came from Minnesota, but I had never heard of her. So that was a surprise to me.
It is, her story does have that continued reach, as you said, Kim, and that dynamic, Addie, that you mentioned between being alone versus loneliness, and that she had, a group of intimate friends that she was with, and then she had that reach of thousands of visitors each year, and she turned to that root beer making to make a life of what she was doing up there, Kim. And why don't you talk a little bit about that root beer making that she did there? It's just kind of, that forms the title of the play there.
Yeah, so she's known as the Root Beer Lady, right? And that was actually not the original title of this play, because I have her in the play pushing back on that title. And I have her hoping that she's known for more than the Root Beer Lady. And I think there's possibly some truth to that she would like to be known for more than that, but that is how she's known, and I'm sure she was grateful for that. So she was selling pop and candy bars up there and renting rooms as a means to survive. After Bill had died, he was doing the same thing. When he was running the resort, it was a resort, renting rooms. But also her concessions were a big thing when you're thirsty on the, canoeing and all day long, and you go to Knife Lake and you get a candy bar and a pop. And so I think that was a big early draw for her. And then with the Wilderness Act in 1964, those businesses were banned, so you couldn't run a business. And so she didn't know how she would do it. And eventually decided that she would go on a donation basis, and that people would donate so that she was able to continue doing her sales and surviving. So at some point, though, when she wasn't able to bring in the pop bottles anymore across the portages, when the float plane ban was established, the float plane would deliver some of her supplies that she couldn't portage over the 6 portages between her and Ely. And so when that was no longer an option, I think she just put the pop aside, and it was just candy bars in the rooms. And then I have her dramatically at one point finding the old root beer bottles in her shed and wondering what to do with them. And an idea is born, and she starts making homemade root beer, and it becomes a big hit, as I think most of the folks on this call will know. So she sold several hundred bottles of root beer a day during a busy summer. She had about 6,000 plus, sometimes 7,000, 8,000 visit her on the island every summer. So she had a lot of foot traffic, and she became known as the Root Beer Lady, and people would stop in to buy a root beer. She had to start limiting them because she would run out. There was some quality control issues because occasionally some root beer that wasn't quite ready to be given to a customer yet was, but I think everyone was of good spirit because everyone loved Dorothy. So she became known as the Root Beer Lady, and she sold root beer right up until the very end. And it was not an easy task imagining making all those hundreds of root beer bottles. She just spent most of her time sometimes alone, but often she had, as you mentioned, folks staying with her for periods of time. Cap, her dad, ended up staying with her for chunks of time, especially in the later years. But in the summer, in the early days, she had Cap, and then her older sister Ruth, and a nephew, and sometimes her brother stop in, and they would stay for a couple weeks. And they would all, be making root beer the whole time, because I don't think one person could have made all the root beer that Dorothy wanted to sell. So.
Thank you, Kim. And Addie, as you hear Kim talk about that period where Dorothy built a business to make her independent life possible, what's resonating with you as a Boundary Waters paddler yourself up there?
How good a root beer would taste.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember I only was in the Boundary Waters from probably summer of 2000 to 2012 or something. So I missed Dorothy up there, but I distinctly remember there was one time where I was with my camp, and there's a bunch of us girls, and we were like, oh, we just really wish there was pop here. And someone was like, there was this woman named the Root Beer Lady and that's how I first heard of her, was like being in the Boundary Waters, having a desire for like not my Nalgene water, like what is it, when you put iodine in it, right? It's been a couple years since I've done that. Yeah, and so I think I just understand the desire for that so much, and for just like finding, another human. Like it's so fun when you're in the Boundary Waters and you come across another group of people, and you're like, oh, you've chosen this journey as well. I know my husband and I got engaged in the Boundary Waters, and I remember that day we just wanted to like find someone to tell them, and so that like there's something about the communities that are formed up there when you're all on an adventure and you're all have this common denominator of loving the nature so much. So
And
yeah.
I will say also that Addie alluded to it, but that she used the water from Knife Lake. That was what she used. The water was that clean and that clear, and that was the possible secret to her root beer was the amazing water from Knife Lake.
And as an organization and as advocates for clean water for everyone, that the fact that Dorothy can make root beer right from the lake, that's something that we want to protect and make possible for the next generations as well. And so, that clean water is at the very core of our value system and protecting that. And so it resonates with us and resonates with the recent decision last week to help extend the protection for the headwaters of the Boundary Waters. Obviously Dorothy's been gone now for 36 years or going on 37 years, and yet her story resonates. So there's a contemporary resonance to a story that went from the 30s to the 80s. And maybe both of you, if you please respond to the question of what are those sort of contemporary values that Dorothy has that are so resonant and relevant today. Kim, why don't you, or either one.
Kim, go for it.
I think she lived life by her own rules. And I think that she did that at a time when women really weren't doing that. And so, and perhaps many people, there's lots of different things that were happening 100 years ago, obviously, than there are now, but she was a woman who decided what her life was going to be like. And she didn't live by the rules that society told her. So I would say for me, I love seeing young women out in the audience, because I think Dorothy's a role model. I think she's a role model for young women and all women about not living to the standards of society places on you, but to live the life that you want to live. And that's not always easy with a system of patriarchy in place. So I think it's a lesson for all of us. And I'm proud to tell that story about a woman who lived life by her own rules. And I will also say that her connection to nature is not unconnected. That she was caring for the earth in a way that we weren't quite awake to, and was aware of the importance of clean water and clean air and picking up trash and not wasting and not destroying things, and everything had to be reused up there, or like there's no garbage pickup. There was no, like, she was taking care of the planet. And I think that of course in what we are living through right now with our planet and the dangers that we have with global warming and everything that's happening right now in the world, I think she was ahead of her time in that, and there's obviously a huge lesson for us in that.
And I would echo everything Kim just so eloquently said. I would elaborate on this sense of, that not only did she know what she wanted, but I think she knew how to be present in a way that is really hard with all of our modern technology. And so there's something about when I always get a little misty-eyed when Kim at the end of the play, says, "Go jump in a lake," and appreciate the nature around you, because there is something that one of the things I love about the Boundary Waters is that I can't reach my iPhone there. And so what does it mean to be truly present and with other humans and with nature wholly and fully, in a way that I just feel like in our modern world, we're so distracted.
And I would also add, I think it was you, Addie, who said this, that it's this and somebody else, a couple conversations I've had about this, is this plays timeliness in terms of coming out of, I mean, we're still in COVID, but coming out of our isolation and our separation from each other, and having this woman who spends much of the show talking to the audience, connecting and communicating in a way that hopefully feels good, you know, that feels like you're being seen, and it's a story, it's a storytelling. So it kind of feels like maybe that is an appropriate antidote right now to some of our division.
Yeah, here.
With the pandemic, a lot of people went to the wilderness to escape and reconnect. And so these last couple of years have been some of the most visited years the Boundary Waters has seen. And you know, it's really interesting that we as an organization were founded in 1976 to create the wilderness area that was established in most fully in 1978. And Dorothy was both, you know, in some ways a supporter, but also an opponent of some of the restrictions that came with that. And one of the things, the values that you talked about a moment ago, Kim, was, you know, Dorothy was really connected to nature, and you know, it's an interesting thought of what wilderness means. And under the 1964 law, wilderness is viewed as, you mentioned in the play, Kim, is untrammeled by men. And then you note in the play, where are the women, right? He asked the question. So there are a lot of things in that law that raise questions. But in addition, it's that people are present in the wilderness, that indigenous people, native people will live there for centuries, and the Wilderness Act you know, doesn't reflect that at all. And so it's an interesting point that the wilderness is about people being in the wilderness as well, and not having this separation. And so you talked about how creative Dorothy was, Kim, to kind of make a living after the Wilderness Act was created, and then how the federal government was an opponent, but then kind of was a cooperator and facilitated facilitated Dorothy's last years. And so talk about that evolution of the relationship where the Forest Service became an ally with Dorothy and kind of made her last year's really, really good ones.
Yeah, I think it's a really cool story, because I was bothered at first by her, like, she fought against the Forest Service. They were basically saying wilderness means you can't live here. So you can't live here, Dorothy Molter. And she didn't like that, because she'd been living there. She fought to keep there. And so she was, you know, fighting, and not probably a big supporter of it, although in her own way, she was like, but I'm taking care of this. I'm doing all this. And so, but that entirely shifted when in her later years, when they really did become allies together and they supported her. And I'll also say there was a certain, as you spoke to the indigenous communities that are there have been centuries of native Ojibwe tribes and others living on the land and still maintain the hunting and fishing rights in the Boundary Waters area. And so I recognize the white privilege that she got to utilize to stay on the land when other people were not allowed that. So her support and everybody, you know, functioned to help her stay on the land. And she is billed as the last non-Indigenous person living on the Boundary Waters. So so this play is told in the shadow of knowing that, and that there are centuries of people who lived there before her and were not treated as well as Dorothy Molter was ultimately treated. But her relationship grew with the Forest Service. And I think she realized that they were trying to do their job and they were trying to protect what she loved. And so there was probably some like, okay, I get it. Like, you know, so how can we work together on this? And, you know, they were eventually generous with her and let her stay until 1975. And then there was other things that happened. And then she got to stay until the end of her life in 1986. So they were very helpful. They ended up bringing things in. They gave her two-way radio, which is the premise of my show, is the communication. So they were checking on her all the time and making sure that this little old lady was okay, who was living in the middle of nowhere. So I think that relationship developed, and the Forest Service took great care of her in her last years.
Great. Yeah. And Addie, as you were trying to help with the pace of the show in those last years, how, what sort of, what was your thought process and as a director in that pace of the show and bringing it to a conclusion there?
Well, it was really a partnership with Kim as we were discovering who the characters are and what parts of the story needed to be more apace. I think obviously the stories that have higher stakes, like the blizzard and getting lost, like there's moments where you're like, oh, the story is climaxing here, and then there's moments where we can sit at her table and have that have that heart to heart conversation. So I think it was really just figuring out, like, well, if she's older in this moment and she's slowing down and also it's an intimate moment, then that's a moment where we're going to be able to sit with her for a little bit while longer. But in order to earn that moment, we need to make sure that we're driving the moment before. Do like any good storytelling. And Kim is, remarkable at that naturally.
Kim, one of the dramatic stories that you tell in the play is when Dorothy sort of rescued Bill Berglund and brought him into town for medical care. Why don't you tell about that story? That was harrowing conditions, and it was a very compelling part of the play.
Yeah. So Dorothy one day noticed Bill hadn't been right for a few days, and she thought it was a kidney infection, which would probably require some medical attention, and she was afraid that he would die. And there was a blizzard. So I have her saying that the options for winter travel at that time, prior to snowmobiles, were dog sled, skis, or snowshoes, and she had one of those three. So she had to snowshoe, carry Bill out to the toboggan that they had, and pull him across 8 lakes and 6 portages. A grown man in a toboggan in a blizzard. And it took them a couple days. They stayed overnight at Birch Lake and in an old trapper cabin, and she managed a fire and managed to keep him alive, and then continued on the way to Ely. When they got to the Border Lake Lodge, pulled in there, called the police, and the sheriff took him to the hospital. And because of her bravery and her amazing hard work for those 2 days in a blizzard, he lived another 8 years, whereas he likely would have died up at the cabin had she not done what she had done to save his life. And so I think that that's one of the remarkable stories of Dorothy, and I think there's more of those stories of what she did and was able to do living in the wilderness to save lives all around her. She was a good nurse.
Yeah, she really drew upon her nursing skills, as you mentioned throughout the play, to taking care of Bill in that dramatic experience, but also the scores and hundreds of other canoeists that needed her attention over the years.
And I'll say that Addie, staged that in such a way that it is, hopefully, the audience feels like they are a part of that journey. We use the upstage space. We have blizzard projections. We have sound. We have me in a red coat, which our costume designer has remarkably designed to be like Dorothy's red coat, folks who know Dorothy in her red coat, with the arm patches on it, with different Canada and some snow clubs. And we have copies of the original patches on our jacket that match what Dorothy's jacket was. So and our set designer too. So that's Sarah Barr, and our set designer Chelsea Warren also. If those who've seen the show or seen pictures have seen the remarkable work that our set designer did to create Dorothy's inner cabin. The set is half her cabin and half outdoors, and also the projections that Chelsea did have been just extraordinary. And the likenesses, I have a picture on the stage of Cap, of my dad, like Dorothy's dad is on there. We have the prop design. It's a remarkable set that I think we've worked really hard to replicate an idea of what Dorothy's life was like up there for the audience, so that they get to experience it and feel it for the 80 minutes that we're together.
And I'll also add, it was an all-female design team, which was pretty exciting for us to be able to work in that environment, and felt very much in the spirit of Dorothy.
Great. Kim, there is no intermission in the play, and so it's 80 minutes long. And why don't you talk about the sort of stamina you need in order to do that, and how do you prepare for that focus that you need for that time period? Because it's an extraordinary thing.
Addie and I have talked many times about this. There's a section where there's Christmas cards that is a voiceover, and I'm always like, that's my break, Addie. I have to just sit and rest for a little bit.
Yeah, there was a moment where she wanted to cut that, and I was like, Kim, you have to have a break.
That's your little break time.
You need a break. We have to build this into the show, and it's good, but yes.
Yeah, it is constant. And I always forget, this is my third solo show, but I always forget like there's no one else talking. And there's a point in rehearsal where I'd be like, isn't anybody else going to do anything? I'm like, oh, still me. It's always still me. So it is stamina and finding the moments to coast and finding the moments to push and keeping connected. In this story, as I've said, this play is all about the connection in a way that I didn't know necessarily in the virtual world. Like I've learned more, especially even the last few days of the performance, like, oh, I'm just telling the story. Like I can, like there's some things that I learned just recently about that and connecting to the audience. So it is a feat, I think, when somebody chooses to do a solo show. And I also think that, like, there's so many parts that help the audience, because I think you get sick of my voice. Like I'm sick of my voice after 80 minutes. I can't imagine the audience is. And so the music helps and the sound effects help and the physical and the variety. So, as a creator of work, I'm always looking for the variety and giving us a break from me. And then, with Addie working together, like what are those moments so that the 80 minutes is, filled and juicy and different and not the same. And I'll also say that I and Addie was in agreement with me, would never want the show to be longer than 90 minutes. It's just, I feel like we want to leave people wanting more, not wanting it to stop. So trying to keep keep it within a time, but solo shows are a different creature, and I hope that people are enjoying the journey. And that's why I think it's also fun to play other characters, because it's not just, I'm having Dorothy tell her story, and she's most definitely telling her story, but also other people pop in who are important to her, and I get to play those too. And so that gives us some fun for the audience and for me as well.
One of those characters, we've had a few questions on this, but why don't you talk about Benny Ambrose, who was kind of her neighbor, if you would, and her relationship with Benny there.
So Benny he lived on a nearby lake, and he also lived alone. And he usually greeted folks with a shotgun. So he was not quite as friendly as Dorothy maybe was, but they were friends, and they shared fruits and vegetables, and he would come down and visit her, and she would occasionally get up to see him. But it was, a couple hours canoe ride. So, but they were the last two people living in what is now the Boundary Waters canoe area wilderness. So, so then he passed away just a couple years before she did, leaving her the last non-Indigenous person living in the Boundary Waters. So I think that they were friends. I think, as much as you are with somebody who, they would stop in, probably check on each other, and make sure each other was still alive and see what each other needed, and brought news to each other, because there was very little news. Dorothy says, I have her saying in the show that the only way to correspond with the outside world was to write a letter and then wait a week to find somebody who's heading back into town and hope they're responsible. So, there was, people bring her newspapers and whatnot, but when you're that isolated, you look for news and information from people. So I think Benny was he also provides us some comedy in the show as well. So I don't, he provides us some comedy in the show as well.
Great. We have a number of comments and questions in here, and I'm trying to cover some of those now as we come up. And there's a question by Kathy here to about Dorothy's sense of humor coming through here, and for sure it does, and Kim, why don't you speak to that? And Addie, if you kind of talk how you try to bring out those multifaceted aspects of Dorothy as a human.
Yeah, I mean, I think she was a funny lady, and I think you have to be to live in the wilderness and do what I mean, how are you going to do that without a sense of humor, right? So, and that was something that, I mean, I'm a comedian, so I am drawn to finding those moments of comedy, and they give me great joy. And I think no story is a complete story without, those moments of comedy or levity or lightness, even in the darkest moments, right? Because we need those. We need those moments even in the darkness. And so, but it was interesting because I pushed away a little bit in her old age from that, and wanted to do something maybe a little bit different. And Addie would very helpfully remind me that we want to see the feisty, wily Dorothy. And I think that was helpful, because I think that feisty, wily Dorothy is true. I think all aspects of her personality, like anybody, we have all kinds of parts of us, but for the stage version, and certainly for telling the stories and for showing her as a full human being, that feistiness and that humor and sarcasm and her little dry sense of humor, I think is what people said she had, certainly. And I think we try to highlight in the show. Yes, Addie?
100%.
So Addie, when you're trying to bring out that feistiness that Kim was talking about, so what did you do to kind of help that along?
Well, Kim's really good at just taking direction. I mean, honestly, it was I would point out the moments that we were feeling most connected to her. And then I would point out the moments where I felt most distant from her storytelling. And the 99% of the time, it was the moments when she was talking directly to us, when she was telling a joke, when she was saying, "Pardon my French," when she was, in the midst of a funny characterization of something. So again, I just really was the first audience for her, but it was so clear in that first preview when we actually had an audience, when it wasn't just poor Kim performing to me, for 2 weeks, that we really realized that that the other character in the play is actually the audience. And so for that interaction to happen, it was most important, and that it really is the jokes where that connection sort of solidifies and lands.
Yeah.
And
Go, please continue, Addie.
Oh, I was just going to say, I will have to step off pretty soon. I have a meeting at 1 p.m. for my job here at the Guthrie, but I do want to just put in a plug. I'm seeing a lot of questions about, like, are we taking this anywhere? There are still some tickets available, though it's very close to being sold out at History Theater. And Kim and History Theater and I are really interested in what it could mean to bring this play elsewhere around, not just the Twin Cities, but around Minnesota, up to Ely, up to Duluth, and Southwestern and Southeastern. But it is not free, obviously. So if you happen to know of a location or are part of a group of people who would love to host the production, we have made it so it's transferable. We can pack that whole set into a truck, I would say, not or a big trailer. And we are really eager to share it with more of Minnesota and tour. But again, it's not free for any of us to do that or to get all of that together. So please do know if you have any access to the resources that might make that feasible. We'd love to share it.
Yeah, and there are still tickets available. We run through the 19th at the History Theater in St. Paul. But yes, we are getting great. We have a couple sold out shows already. So
every Sunday is sold out right now, and most Saturdays are almost sold out.
So that's great news. There's lots of interest in Dorothy.
And in Kim's amazing performance. So
it really is a tour de force, Kim. You really nailed it. And for 80 minutes, keeping the audience engaged and keeping that energy up and having that rhythm throughout it. It was really tremendous. And we at the Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness are interested in continuing that conversation, Addie and Kim, about how we could bring the play to other parts of Minnesota here. And so it's something that we're very excited about, bringing that story that has resonance today. And I know there were a lot of questions of people here that we did not get to. What I'd like to ask people that are watching, because a lot of you did meet Dorothy, and if you would do this. If you would please send us your Dorothy Molter stories, and we'll collate some of these, and we can be a bit of an archive for that. And I'll give you you can send it to my email address, and it's hard for me to talk and type at the same time. So I'll have perhaps Maggie, if you could put that in the chat, my email address. It's Chris, CHRIS at friends_BWCA.com, and we'll collect some of these stories of Dorothy Molter and begin to make sure that this living history remains here. And so
could you also save the chat? I would love to read some of the comments in the chat as well. If you could send me the chat. I know I didn't get a chance to read everything, but lots of people are putting great stuff in the chat too. So.
Yeah, there was a really amazing conversation among our audience here that is the other participant in this, right? and so I want to thank you, Kim. I want to thank you, Addie, for making time to have this conversation. I want to thank all our participants for being here on this lunch with their friends as well. I'm going to put 2 dates on the calendar for people in the audience. One is actually this Friday. We are protecting the clean water of the boundary waters in Lake Superior. And there is actually a court hearing Friday afternoon in one of our battles to protect the clean water from the Polymet mine. And so there's an important court hearing at 2:30 p.m. If you come to our offices here in St. Paul at near University and 280 at 2 o'clock, we'll have an early happy hour, and we'll have our attorney, Max Kiley, give a briefing in anticipation of this hearing. And so please come to our office at 2 o'clock this Friday for early happy hour, some food and beverages, and get a debriefing on this important hearing that is coming up in the Polymet case. And then on February 15th, in 2 weeks from now, we are protecting the boundary waters through legislative action. And so we'll have a deep dive into our efforts to protect the boundary waters through legislation. So that's February 15th at 12 noon Central Time. And so thank all of you. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you to you and the into this Boundary Waters group and all the people who are on here, because this is Dorothy's land and it's up to us to continue to protect it and save it. And this is in honor of Dorothy Molter, because she would be thrilled. She would be thrilled by the Friends of the Boundary Water that there's people who are protecting the land and the water that she cared about so deeply. So the work you're doing is so important. And as the person playing Dorothy Molter, I thank you for your continued care of the Boundary Waters.
Thank you for your graciousness there, Kim. And again, thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Drink a Dorothy Molter root beer in honor of the play. So have a great afternoon. Goodbye, Kim. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.